The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 841 A Big Order. Mary appeared in front of Lex, looking just as alarmed as him. She quickly searched through the information she had, which made her grimace. According to the guide, there are a few circumstances in which the keys, and other associated powers, will cease to work. One such situation is if using the ability will result in catastrophic or irreversible damage. The keys, specifically, could also fail if they are in some unique spaces, or are being blocked by certain powers with strong enough protection. You saw the same thing when you entered the tower in the Crystal Realm. Lex did not want to play the blame game right now, where he accused the system of hiding such information from him. The truth was that while the system never informed him, he never asked either. He instead focused on the situation. Luther had only transmitted limited information to him, so he had to dissect it carefully to get as much information as possible. The key pieces were that the Midnight Inn was specifically being targeted, that they were on a planet called BGY 987, and that the keys did not work in the space where they were. The notification he got when the business card was used also stated that space was fragile in the location they were trying to use it. There were sufficient clues, so he was more or less certain that he had guessed correctly. The problem now was to decide what to do. The issue this time was outside of the inn, and he had no real power there. But he had all the resources of the Midnight Inn to help to resolve the issue in a roundabout manner. His mind worked in overdrive to come up with a plan. If he reached them, how would he rescue them? The easiest way would be to send them to the inn, but that was an issue at the moment. How was he going to reach them? What was he supposed to do if he faced an enemy much stronger than himself? What if this was a trap? Countless thoughts ran through Lex's mind, and just as quickly as they came, he resolved each and every one of them. A plan formed in his mind, but even in his agitated and aggravated state, he did not rush to action. No, right now Lex's mind was cool and free from all distractions. Now that he had thought about what to do, he went over the plan a few times to anticipate what problems he could face. There were parts of the plan where he would have to improvise, but there was nothing he could do about that. He stored the chipped jewel and teleported to X-142, before promptly entering the Infinity Emporium. Powell, as usual, was waiting for him and smiled warmly. Just as the merchant was about to welcome Lex, and even jab him on the return of his skin in good humor, Lex held up his hand and stopped him. I have no time, and I require the best and quickest service my membership of the Emporium affords. I need an item that can immediately stabilize space as quickly as possible. If there's more than one, I'll take everything. I also need any and all powerful weapons you have immediately available that anyone can use. Also, is it possible for you to get your hands on something from the planet BGY 987 from the Fugan battlefield within Swera? If that's possible, I can afford to wait a bit. Before Powell could ask any question, Lex flicked the small, chipped jewel at the man. Take that as payment. As soon as Powell grabbed the jewel, he was visibly startled, and even starstruck. He froze with his mouth hung open as he looked at the jewel, trying to discover why his senses were indicating that this was extremely valuable, yet he could not identify it. Powell, I have no time. Lex said firmly, waking the merchant up from his stupor. I'll get on it immediately, he said, and ran towards the back door. This was another big order for him. Chapter 842 Survive. Luther's mind worked at full speed as he saw the massive tear in space. He had to report to the Innkeeper as quickly as possible, and then get to the tear before the massive creature slithering out of it completely emerged. He channeled his energy into the card, ready to transmit the message, when a familiar aura pervaded the area, causing everyone to freeze. Even the Void Dweller, partially exited from the space rip, froze in deference to the aura. But the weight of it was too much. The planet itself trembled and the skies wept with as agonizing moan as reality itself seemed on the verge of fracture. Immediately the aura withdrew and Luther felt a brief, fleeting connection with the Innkeeper. Clearly, even without knowing the situation, the Innkeeper had tried to help, but the space here could not sustain his powers. It would be more lethal than helpful to them if he acted, even if only using the card as a conduit. Understanding that no immediate help would arrive, Luther sent what little information he could. He did not expect to be saved, so he was not really disappointed. Instead, he was grateful that the innkeeper's aura had at least slowed down the arrival of the void dweller, or their situation would be even worse. Z, you only have one move, Luther instructed, as he silently initialized the one move that the battalion had become especially renowned for. Though Luther never officially gave the order, the members of the battalion were all too familiar with the process. Wordlessly and efficiently they played their part, merging together to form the Midnight Mech. Active 2, Z, momentarily distracted by the strange connection he felt in the spatial cracks, gathered himself, took command of the mech, and directed its solemn gaze towards the emerging void dweller. Z braced himself before channeling the awesome power of the mech, and forcefully trying to use his spatial affinity. Due to the fact that countless other members of the battalion had the same affinity, plus the multiplied energy reserves of the mech, the influence Z could wield on space was much greater. While he still could not do as he pleased, he could at least try to contain the disaster. Under Z's efforts, a spatial ripple was released from the mech. But instead of destroying space as they usually did, the ripple seemed to absorb the energy of the tear, preventing it from spreading. A few moments later, another ripple was released, and then another. Unbelievably, the massive tear began to retreat, and space began to heal itself. I'm sending help. Survive as long as possible, a familiar voice entered Luther's ears. But since he was currently merged with the rest through the mech, they all heard the comforting words. He was beaten and battered, and almost completely mentally drained, but hearing the innkeeper's voice gave Z the little bit of strength he needed to continue his effort until the space tear was closed. As soon as the tear was closed, however, he dismissed the mech. Ordinarily, using the mech was not so taxing on any one person since they all shared the burden. But in this instance, since he was forcefully exerting his affinity in such a fragile place, Z was especially exhausted. The others looked drained, but Z fell to his knees as his consciousness waned in and out. A thin, firm hand quickly grabbed onto Z before he fell flat on his face, and helped him steady himself. Gather yourself, soldier, said Sandra, her voice filled in equal parts with both teasing and comfort. We have our orders. We have to survive as long as possible. So no sleeping on the job. Chapter 843 Bottom's Grace. Lex counted each second that Powell was gone, though his mind kept telling him not to do that. Unless Powell was able to get something from that planet that still contained its aura, Lex would have to spend a long time reaching it no matter what. Instead of wasting time and energy, Lex began to refine his plan once more. There were a few areas where he would have no option but to improvise. He began considering various actions he could take. Even with his mind distracted, Lex was all too aware that he tapped his foot on the ground 9 times before Powell returned. Due to his agitation, the speed of his tapping was fast, translating to 2 taps per second. Powell took 4.5 seconds to go and return. Although Lex had asked him to hurry, that kind of efficiency was remarkable. I have activated the perks from your membership, so you will be getting the best of our service. A number of Powells are on the way, bringing every space-related item we have. I have also procured a list of all the easily usable weapons we have. Selections include guns, bombs, curses, talismans, and such. Unfortunately, we cannot access Fugan battlefields at all, and conducting any kind of trade that has anything to do with them is severely frowned upon. Without waiting for any kind of response from Lex, Powell opened up a projection of a list of items in front of Lex. At the very top were the various space-related items they had available at that very moment, only after which were the weapons. Lex scanned through the list, reading the description of each item carefully. Not only did they have to be useful, but they needed to be easy to use and difficult to disrupt. There were over 400 space-related items that the Emporium had in stock at that very moment, but only 3 that suited Lex's needs. The most ideal was a high-powered and extremely rare talisman. You might also want to take a look at this, Powell said, and showed Lex the details for another item. At first, Lex simply glanced over, but when he saw the item, his eyes gleamed. The item was in the shape of angel wings and was made of clay. According to its description, within it the item contained an extremely potent holy aura from an archangel, which had almost magical healing properties towards non-demons. Of course, if used against demons, it had an equally poisonous effect. The most intriguing thing was that the item's name was Botlam's Grace. Lex did not ponder over the origin of the item, or why he was seeing the name Botlam once again. Since it was useful, Lex bought the item. It took nearly a minute for another Powell to burst through the door, holding a small spatial ring containing all the items Lex bought. He transferred everything into his own bangle, then immediately left. Once he returned to the inn, Lex did not immediately head for the teleportation formation that would take him to the battlefield. No, instead he headed towards the museum where Lex procured every missile he had collected from the dragon's hoard. Pell had previously described the use of each of the missiles to him, so this time he would not be caught unprepared when he used them. In total, Lex stored 43 such missiles. Each one had the potential to kill an earth immortal, with some of the stronger ones even capable of injuring a heavenly immortal. If they didn't reach at least such a level, they would not have been worth being added to the dragon's collection. Though, ultimately, to the dragon, they were only trinkets to be collected. After all, as an authentic heavenly immortal, each one of the dragon's attacks was more powerful than those rockets. With the weapons taken, he looked up towards the massive ship. It would be so much easier if he could take that out of the inn. But, since he couldn't for now, he would make do. With his host attire still equipped, Lex looked for the only other member of the inn who would be accompanying him. "Cirque, stop whatever you're doing. There's a mission that requires your skills." Chapter 844, Crazy Enough. Cirque, who was resting since he was on break, immediately stood up as soon as he heard the innkeeper's voice. Before he knew it, he had been teleported over to the Midnight Tailors, where the innkeeper was already waiting for him. "Innkeeper." Cirque greeted, not used to seeing his boss in person, but the innkeeper was already walking inside. "Keep up. This is a matter of grave urgency." Cirque dared not keep the innkeeper waiting, so he rushed in behind him. "Jeeves, I don't have much time," the innkeeper said as soon as he walked in. "Cirque has to leave the inn on a mission. What's the best suit you can give him for protection right at this moment?" "We don't have time for a custom job right now." "Innkeeper, my ready-made selection is somewhat bare," Jeeves responded immediately, his voice calm and collected even under pressure. "I have one inspired by the suit given to the battalion, but without specifically altering it to Cirque's body, he won't be able to draw the most out of it." "Bring it out," he ordered Jeeves, before turning to the spaceship captain. "Cirque, I need you to accompany another worker out on a mission. You may be required to pilot the Silent Wanderer, so I hope you are ready. Keep in mind that the suit I'm giving you is not tailored to you, so avoid getting into any fights when possible." Lex activated the formation, teleporting himself and Jeeves away. The duo appeared in the same teleportation hall that the battalion had arrived in earlier. Jeeves looked around and saw that they were standing in the middle of a formation, and there were countless other similar formations in the hall. Tens of thousands of soldiers were teleporting over each minute, making the hall both crowded and busy. Leo, who was standing beside him, had an unusual mask over his face, making him look like a devil. Cirque did not need to ask to know that he was hiding his identity, for whatever reason. "Welcome to Battlefront 00974, spoke a nearby elf who was looking at a clipboard rather than them. "Is there a leader among you two? Since only 2 of you have arrived, I assume you have the designation of strategic assets. Do you have any speciality?" Instead of answering, Lex walked up to the elf and placed a hand upon his shoulder. The action was quite simple, but for the elf who was on the receiving end of Lex's domination in full force, gravity seemed to have increased by 100-fold. Let alone his body, even his thoughts seemed to be weighed down under the massive force that was enveloping his being. "That is none of your concern," Lex commanded. "Take me to someone who has knowledge of the ongoing battle." Yes, the elf stuttered and turned to lead the duo in a daze. Lex's action attracted some attention from a few nearby guards, but upon noticing that the elf turned and began to lead the two, they relaxed. Even though Lex had removed his hand and walked a step behind the elf, the effects of his domination had not diminished at all. Completely unaware of his own actions, the elf led the two past all the lines, skipping all the queues, and directly towards a command room. No one noticed anything amiss the entire time. After all, no one thought that anyone would be crazy enough to cause trouble here. Chapter 845 Confidential. Although the sight of an elf, a mysterious being wearing a devilish mask and a human walking through the base, should have seemed out of place, in actuality, that was far from the truth. There were hundreds of races Lex had never seen in any room they crossed, and each of them was being led by an elf. The second indicator of something unusual should have been the cold, nearly oppressive aura Lex was giving off, despite the fact that he was only targeting the elf with domination. But once again, given that this was a place filled with soldiers and warriors, nearly everyone was displaying their aura. Regardless of whether it was weak or strong, fiery hot and icy cold, none of the soldiers shied away from displaying their worth through their auras. It was an unspoken form of communication. Moreover, amidst the millions that were moving around the base, neither Lex nor Cirque were close to being the strongest, so no one suspected them at all. Besides using notorious anonymity to hide his face, Lex did not really make any effort to hide his identity or actions either. Moreover, he was sure that while many would be unable to peer through the facade of his devilish mask, there were too many in this base who could see through it. He was completely prepared to have his identity revealed. It was not even a concern for him at this point, more of a formality that he was just going along with. Cirque, who had no idea what Leo was planning, remained completely composed, and followed his lead perfectly. He did not show any hesitation or doubt about Lex's actions. A part of that was from his steady personality, but a lot of it also was due to the unwavering trust he had in the other members of the Midnight Inn. If the Innkeeper had trusted him, then there had to be a reason for it. Sir, according to the latest update, conducted 47 minutes ago, everything is within expectations on the stated planet. Combat with local entities is taking place, and is expected to continue for another 10 days. There have been no requests for reinforcements, so they are managing with only the initially allocated forces. They have been giving clear and detailed reports on their updates regularly. Would you like me to pull up those reports? Lex frowned. It looked like whoever was targeting the inn had even breached the alliance. But that was fine. He was never planning on getting help from them in the first place. In fact, it would be helpful if they kept out of his way. Pull up the location data on that planet, as well as the best routes from here to there. Cirque, come and see if you can understand this. Since the elf had already obeyed Lex once, doing so again became easier and had less hesitation. He immediately started pulling up the highly confidential data, which was the star map inside of the cosmic cloud. This was updated live by the Alliance and was based on their own discoveries within the region. Mapping the cosmic cloud using telescopes and other long-distance observation methods was impossible due to severe interference, so the value of this map was inestimable. Just as Cirque was studying the data, a very large, dark figure approached the group. "What the hell is going on here?" the figure asked aggressively, exuding an aura that far surpassed Lex. "Who are you? How did you come in?" The group froze under that aura, all except Lex, who only turned and looked at the figure evenly. Chapter 846, The Hell. What the hell is going on? Lex repeated, as he looked up at the towering figure. Unlike the somewhat feeble elves working in this room, this figure radiated a powerful aura even without revealing his cultivation. He had an elven appearance, meaning he had 2 legs that he stood on, and 2 arms, as well as a torso and head. But that is where the similarities ended. Instead of leather or skin, the creature had dark gray scales that almost seemed like they were made of stone. A long yet slender tail extended out from the base of his back, sweeping across the floor behind him. He had 2 horns protruding from his forehead, but unlike many animals that Lex saw on Earth where the horns were sharp and pointed, the creature's horns spread out over the creature's head like a partial helmet. Its eyes were black, with light gray vertical pupils, and were currently focused entirely on Lex. His aura of a peak nascent realm was crashing down heavily, though it seemed to only be doing so on Lex and Cirque. Still, the entire room was hushed down, and all eyes turned to look at him. The figure apparently had some renown. Unfortunately, despite his stronger cultivation, he was at an absolute disadvantage when facing Lex. That was because this figure, much like Xeon, was part dragon. Lex could clearly sense the diluted dragon's blood running through the creature's veins. But the very fact that he was in the nascent realm instead of an earth immortal was enough to betray the fact that he was not a true dragon. Dragonlings were usually very strong, and more often than not, inherited a dragon's resistance to nearly all elements and forms of damage. But they also had an extremely pronounced weakness, which was that they become completely subservient in front of a true dragon. It was not a matter of whether they wanted to or not, it was programmed into their genes. Who are you? The figure managed to ask with his stuttering voice. You can't be here. Lex did not even answer the figure, but just looked at him derisively. He needed to keep matters here calm until they left. If someone tried to stop them, he was also ready to retaliate, although it would be best to avoid such a situation. After all, he was already anticipating a trap. That's why he didn't bother explaining the situation properly to one of the superiors or commanders here. There was no guarantee that they weren't involved with whoever was targeting the inn. It would be best to handle this matter privately, and as quietly as possible. I've learned the route, suddenly said Cirque, who stepped behind Lex. Getting there should not be a problem, although there will be many checkpoints along the way. If we can get clearance, getting through would be much easier. Otherwise, we will have to go around, which will take much longer. Lex nodded and reached into his suit pocket and pulled out an envelope, and threw it towards the tall figure. The dragonling managed to catch it right before the envelope hit his face. Somehow, despite being taller than Lex, he could not shake the feeling that he had been looked down on the entire time. We're a part of the Midnight Inn, going to go take our soldiers back. Deliver that to your highest ranked superior and make sure to give us clearance as we pass through. You, Berlin, lead me to the hangar. We're flying out. Led by the still absent-minded elf, the two of them walked out of the room, finally allowing everyone to escape the influence of domination. They all breathed a sigh of relief, but none was more flustered than the dragonling. In his hand, he held an envelope that radiated an aura even more intimidating than the one displayed by the masked man earlier. He nearly dropped to his knees. Chapter 847 Hangar. The words on the envelope seemed to be growing bigger and bigger in the dragonling's eyes. They were two simple words, but the power contained within them encompassed his mind and body, petrifying him where he stood. Yet none of the aura actually leaked out, so all the elves looked out at him curiously. The two strangers had already left, exiting as simply as they entered, after causing an unprecedented scene within the Alliance headquarters. There may have been many deals and manipulations in the shadows and hidden from sight, but never had such a thing been done so openly. Even the weakest elf in the room could sense that the repercussions of this would go far and wide. The background of that man must be far from simple if he, alone, had the confidence to confront the entire Alliance based on nothing but its name. Most of them had never heard of the Midnight Inn before, but they would not forget it easily. As for the few who had, they quickly associated it with one of the newer battalions that had joined their army, the Midnight Battalion. Among other things, what they were most famous for was that despite going to multiple battlefields, they had yet to lose a single soldier, despite their low cultivation levels. Hesitantly, as if unsure of his actions, one of the elves came and tapped the dragonling on his shoulder. "Update me if there are any changes," Lex said. He did not show any urgency, but he knew that currently they were in a very precarious situation. As soon as reports of what happened in the coordination room reached one of the higher management, even if the base itself was not locked down, Lex and Cirque would at least be arrested pending further investigation. Or, it was more apt to say that they would try to arrest them. But, as unbelievable as it was, they did not encounter any issues all the way until they entered the hangar. The elf walked in normally, but both Lex and Cirque could not help but take a moment to take the sight in. The biggest ship they had seen so far was the massive one flying over the Midnight Inn, but in the hangar there were countless ships of the same size, and many ships even larger. There were millions of soldiers of various races climbing into the various ships in a very orderly fashion. Moreover, the ships would not just randomly start flying and take off. There was a very strict sequence of events for each ship's takeoff, lest they damage not only the other ships here, but the various soldiers as well. Once all the required personnel were loaded onto the ship, the platform it was parked on would detach, and then move the ship into a queue of waiting ships ready to leave. Once it was a ship's turn, it would be taken to an isolation formation that would prevent any of the released energy, heat from the rockets or thrusters, or any other harmful substance that leaked during its takeoff period from affecting the rest of the base or the others. The mere hangar, one of many, was unimaginably large, and Lex could not see the ends of it. Many of the ships here had lengths of hundreds of miles, though he immediately noticed that it was only the smaller ships that seemed to be leaving for now. All the larger ships were parked, and showed no signs of being prepared for departure. Moreover, just besides the ships and soldiers, the hangar was filled with countless machines of war that far surpassed anything Lex had ever imagined. Tanks and mech seemed so ordinary and mundane in comparison. His fancy contact lens seemed to know all of them and kept labeling each one for him to see. But Lex only gave that first initial moment's worth of attention to the massive fighting force collected in front of him. He turned to the elf and said, "Take me to someone who can expedite our departure. We have our own ship." Chapter 848 Letter. The elf paused, as if unsure who to take Lex towards. It seemed that, unlike previously where he knew someone personally in the coordination room, he did not know anyone here. But the hesitation only lasted so long. Lex did not need him to be taken to anyone familiar. Anyone with sufficient authority would do. As he walked past the different sections, Lex noticed that this was the most organized area he had been in so far. The number of guards at each point was considerably higher than before, and at each point, they would authenticate the identity and reason of anyone passing through. Even they had to go through a couple of checkpoints, although fortunately the elf reporting that they were going to go report to one of the ground managers made it a lot easier. Lex did not want to jinx his luck, but he could foresee that getting through this area without causing a scene might be harder than the previous room. The command deck, where they were finally led to, stood as an elevated island amidst the sea of activity, a nerve center pulsating with coordinated precision. Officers and officials huddled over holographic displays, strategizing and dispatching orders with a sense of grave responsibility. Lex, undeterred by the orchestrated commotion, followed the elf as they approached a stern-faced officer standing at the threshold of the command center. Unlike all the elves Lex had encountered so far, this one wore a stern and strangely human expression on his face. His build was also more sturdy as compared to the more nimble elves, and even without his attention focused on them as of yet, Lex could detect an intensity from his being. This elf was very powerful, and his high cultivation level of at least Earth Immortal was only just a part of it. Even among his peers, he was surely formidable. In Lex's cold, raging mind, a new strategy began to weave itself. Suppressing him with domination would not work, and Lex had already given his envelope away. That might have worked here as well, but having given it away already was not such a bad thing. This could work out in his favor. Suppressing his urge to smack Lex across the face, the officer pulled up a projection and immediately looked for who the dragonling from the resources coordination room was. Then he found out who the dragonling reported to, and directly initiated a call. As a soldier, it was sometimes more important to ensure there was no issue with any ongoing missions, even if he had to sacrifice his own ego in the process. In another portion of the headquarters, in a private office, the dragonling in question stood in difference behind an elf. Since this battlefield was within the Swirl galaxy, most crucial positions were either held by elves or dwarves. Since dwarves were more likely to take on roles of either refiners or warriors, most leadership positions fell to the elves. Such a situation led to most elves feeling extremely proud and arrogant. Yet at this moment, this once proud and arrogant elf was sweating non-stop. When preparing the letter within that envelope, Lex had used the official letterhead as well as the innkeeper's pen and the inkwell. He had also poured all his anger into the words he wrote in that letter, which translated into the kind of aura they contained. The elf, who had been strong enough to look past the envelope itself, which carried only the title of the author of the letter, had been rocked to his very core when he opened the letter. The full force of the innkeeper's fury was exhibited in the few words that the letter contained. It simply read, "Stay the fuck out of my business." Chapter 849 Contingency Plan I. The dragonling who delivered the letter stood far back in the distance, so that he would not be under the influence of the envelope and the letter that it contained. As a half-dragon, he had always been extremely prideful. Moreover, it was exceptionally strong as well. It could attempt to break into the earth immortal realm whenever it wanted, but suppressed that growth itself. By working for the Alliance, it hoped to gain enough credits to have the Alliance help it transition from part dragon to complete dragon. At that point it would naturally break through, and would be much stronger than it would have if it broke through normally. After serving on various battlefields, and accruing numerous commendations, it was exceptionally close to its goal, which was also the reason it had been pulled back from the battlefield. Its successful service only increased its pride, yet ironically it was here, in the supposedly safe headquarters, where its pride had been thoroughly crushed. While it had not yet recovered from the ordeal, it decided to stay away from the letter and whatever it had to say. Looking at its superior sweating, it suddenly felt like it had made a wise decision. The elf in question was currently experiencing a personal Armageddon. Lightning was flashing, thunder was roaring, the ground was quaking, tsunamis high enough to blot out the sun were arriving on the horizon. All of that was, of course, only happening in his mind. Yet that did not change that the elf felt like it was the target of all these calamities. It could feel an anger that could destroy the heavens radiating from the words on his letter, and though the elf was not the target of that anger, he had somehow become a victim of it nonetheless. A soft, familiar ringing sounded in the office, and the elf was finally broken free from the grasp of the letter, his trembling hands dropping it. The elf did not dare to look at it again, but reflexively answered the phone call that was ringing. Lightenfeld Tsar, have you received a letter of clearance for departure for someone from the Midnight Inn? The person on the other end of that call asked, getting straight to the point. Though the envelope had dropped, those words sounded like thunder in the elf's ears. He opened the battalion panel and spoke to Luther. The enemy probably knows help is coming. Prepare accordingly. This was once again risky, for if the enemy became too desperate, they might just end up doing something that would get everyone killed. Lex was relying on the fact that their enemy, whoever it was not able to muster up enough strength, for whatever reason. After all, the battalion only consisted of Foundation realm soldiers. Together, they were not weak, but they couldn't really claim to be too strong either. There were too many ways to deal with them if someone really wanted to. The fact that they hadn't done so yet is what made Lex think this was a trap. While Lex was musing such issues, they reached the loading dock and Lex released the silent wanderer from its spatial case. The sudden appearance of a ship attracted some attention from the nearby staff, but in such a place unusual occurrences were somewhat of a norm. Through the use of some heavy machinery, the ship was being loaded properly onto the platform which would take it to the departure formation. All of this seemed to be standard procedure, and everything was going according to plan, when Lex noticed a powerful aura approaching. Oi. Oi. You the numbskulls that are delaying everyone's launch? What the hell gives you the right to stop all the other ships, eh? We have urgent business too. Lex turned and saw a dwarf at the immortal realm approaching them. He was clearly incensed at his departure being delayed to accommodate Lex. So much for not causing a scene, Lex murmured. Then he unleashed his aura, and his contingency plan. Chapter 850 Contingency Plan 2. When he turned to look at the dwarf, he channeled his spirit energy into his spatial bangle and had it at the ready. Although he had survived the attack of an earth immortal before, he had been gravely wounded in the process. Suffice to say he could not go up against an immortal on his own. He also did not want to take any risks, or waste time arguing with unnecessary people. Not to mention, the dwarf might just be with the enemy, and simply pretending to cause problems to get closer. In short, there were more than enough reasons for Lex to be prepared. If you have a problem, take it up with the superiors, Lex said plainly. He was trying to deflect responsibility in the hopes that this would become someone else's problem long enough that they could leave. But of course, that hope was destined to become a disappointment. The immortal dwarf, who was already blaring his aura as if he was afraid people wouldn't notice him causing a ruckus, seemed almost offended that Lex wasn't suppressed to the point where he couldn't even respond. "I'll take my problem up with your skull if you don't get on your knees, vermin." The dwarf's aura crashed down on Lex even harder as he yelled, and his face warped into a distorted grimace. Countless others had noticed the situation, and a number of guards were already on the way to resolve the situation. Far away, Lex could also tell that the officer who had given him departure clearance was alarmed by the situation, and was paying attention to it. A part of Lex's brain told him that if he held out for just a few seconds, others would solve the problem for him. But the majority of Lex's brain had already decided that this dwarf was working for whoever was targeting the inn. Why else would he behave so absurdly? Instead of responding to the dwarf, Lex held out his hand above his head, and a massive rocket appeared in it, its tip pointing towards the dwarf. In the distance, an elf appeared silently in the room, surrounded by a large entourage. But in his trembling hands, he held a letter. As a celestial immortal, he had not been overwhelmed by the aura of the letter, but he understood clearly that certain matters had gone far outside the range of his authority. Now he just wanted to get the representative of the Midnight Inn out of here as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, the next report he received wasn't of Lex departing. Instead, it was of him wielding immortal weapons right in the hangar. Absolute hate was radiating in his eyes, but he was not looking at Lex, but the dwarf. What was that maniac thinking? A part of Lex's brain took in all the information of what was happening around him. Most of his brain, however, was focused solely on the dwarf. "You know, I've come to realize that my relationship with dwarfs is not that great," Lex spoke softly. Lifting his hand, Lex tapped the dwarf's face a couple of times, like one might do to a kid they were encouraging. "In the future, remember your place," Lex said softly. He had not slapped the immortal, but what he had done was many times more humiliating. But no one noticed that each time Lex's hand touched the dwarf, it seemed to fade a bit, as if disappearing. Lex was using his newest ability to turn his body into thought itself, and reading the surface of the dwarf's thoughts. This was not a true intrusion into the dwarf's brain, or else it would have required more effort. Lex simply wanted to know if the dwarf truly harbored malicious intent, was or just an ill-tempered fellow. Fortunately for the dwarf, it seemed like the case was the latter. Lex looked around the hangar once and saw countless faces staring at him. The dwarf wasn't the only one who could sense the danger from those weapons. With his point made, Lex turned around and walked away. The rockets, however, kept floating in the air until both Cirque and Lex boarded the silent wanderer. Even when Lex withdrew them back into his spatial bangle, no one moved. Chapter 851, The Words He Wanted to Hear. Despite having the silent wanderer for a long time, Lex had never actually spent much time in it. He had familiarized himself with it, sure, but that included nothing more than a simple tour. He also did not know how to pilot it yet, although it was certainly on his agenda. Cirque, however, had piloted it in both simulations and in real life, although in person he did nothing more than simple systems checks. Although compared to other ships, the Silent Wanderer was tiny, in reality it was quite big. It had 4 bedrooms, a kitchen, a large storage area, a main hall and a cockpit where only 2 pilots could enter. If they decided to cramp people inside, up to 30 people could fit inside the Wanderer, but any more would be problematic. This was also why he made preparations to send the soldiers back via teleportation rather than taking them back through his ship. With not much else to do, Lex joined Cirque in the cockpit, where he was busy turning the ship on and preparing for launch. The platform it was parked on was already moving, so by the time the ship finished its startup sequence, it would be ready to go. Although everything was proceeding smoothly, or so it seemed, Lex did not drop his guard. At the first sign of trouble, he was ready to pull those bombs out. If there are no problems, and we move at maximum speed, how long will it take us to reach BGY 987? Lex asked, his eyes still trained on all the guards outside. If there are no hurdles and everything goes smoothly, with the Silent Wanderer's hyperdrive systems, we can reach it within 9 days. An ordinary ship would require 2 weeks at least. Lex pursed his lips, but said nothing. 9 days was a very long time. He hoped nothing amiss would happen. He was already doing the best that he could. Amidst the cold fury that reigned in his mind at the moment, a tinge of sadness briefly appeared. 20 minutes later, the ship was completely turned on and had been brought into the launch formation. Silently, true to its name, the ship rose into the air, and then launched into the atmosphere. Within just a few seconds, it was already out of sight. The more incredible thing was, it also escaped all their radars. The stealth technology on this ship was more advanced than ordinary military ships used even by the Alliance. The celestial elf finally turned his gaze from the ship to the dwarf. "Just tell me who put you up to it," the elf said, not bothering with the gimmicks. For putting the entire base at risk, whoever the instigator was, they were in for a world of trouble. Before the dwarf had time to confess, the Celestial also ordered a detailed report on the planet Lex had investigated. Apparently, there was something wrong with the situation there. If an outsider noticed before them, it would be an embarrassment to them all. "That's absurd." "You'll die," the elf exclaimed, startled. "No, we won't. Sitting around is not really our style, and letting the enemy plot uninterrupted is also not good. Moreover, one of my scouts reported another group resisting the void dwellers. We're going to go out, strike the enemy, and bring back those other survivors." The two tried to protest or change Luther's mind, but it was already made up. Luther did not need to explain to anyone besides the battalion, and since the battalion never questioned him, he did not bother to explain at all. Standing on the fort wall, Luther looked at all the battalion members once. In some he saw fatigue, in some he saw excitement. Some of them looked fresh, as if they had just taken a nap, while others looked like they were in serious need of a rest. But no matter what, none of them looked afraid, or hesitant for that matter. "There is an enemy targeting us," he said simply before turning to look out at the horizon. "The Innkeeper has already sent help. They are on their way. The only question is, when they arrive, will they find us hiding out in a hole like cowards, or will they find us out there fighting?" His words were not loud or forced. He had spoken calmly and turned before receiving any response at all. But the response he was looking for was not one of words, anyway. When the battalion took their first step behind him, the ground trembled under their uniform stomp. As the battalion began their march, it was not just their stomping that shook their ground. An aura began to rise, not from individuals, but from the battalion as a whole. It was an aura of a wrath tamed, of a fury held back, of a monster waiting to be unleashed. In front of them a tear opened and a fresh wave of void dwellers poured out, before they quickly began to pounce towards them. Yet the soldiers of midnight did not stop or hesitate, but only started to march faster, until they almost entered a run. When the two sides met, it was not a clash, but a clean slice. Without losing any momentum at all, they cut through the void dwellers and approached the tear. But instead of releasing more dwellers, the tear closed as if afraid of the battalion itself. But none of them showed any pride in such a minor victory. As they had done so many times before already, this time they did not march out to gain small victories, but to change the tide of the war. Luther set the direction. They were not heading towards the Marzu first, who were the only other survivors on the planet. No, they were going towards where the demons had gathered. If the enemy was trying to build something, then they would knock it down. If there was going to be a monument on this planet, it would only be made of the corpses of their enemies and nothing else. Chapter 852 New Performance. Something unusual happened once the battalion left the fort. The frequency of attacks on the fort itself dropped, though they did not disappear completely. But that decrease in frequency did not actually make their lives easier, as with the battalion gone, a bulk of their fighting force had disappeared. The remaining soldiers felt somewhat resentful at the battalion for leaving them, but only a few were clear-headed enough to realize that the battalion was not really responsible for everyone's security to begin with. Moreover, going and interfering with the enemy's plan might just allow them to survive until someone finally noticed what was happening here. Although, the fact that it had been so long without any communication was enough to let them know something was terribly amiss. But with no other solution available to them, all they could do was hope. Of course, the Midnight Battalion could do a lot more than just hope. Many things were outside of their control, but they could at least ensure that their enemy's plans failed. 1000 had reported to Luther that the enemy wanted to pull the entire planet into the void using some kind of formation they were building. Destroying that was integral to ensuring that they could even be rescued at all. Then, Luther also had a mind to capture some prisoners for later interrogation. Finally, there was that ultimate charm of watching your enemy's plans fail to come to fruition and knowing it was all because of you waiting for them. It had taken 1000 many hours to reach the cliff on his own, so one would assume that the battalion would take even longer since there were more people. However, over the course of their service, the battalion had experienced many harvests, and one of those was a passive augmentation technique. The technique worked on the principle of resonance, and the more people using it, the greater the resonance would be. It was not useful in actual combat situations, as the circulation of spiritual energy within one's body required to use the technique was fairly complex and would clash with any other spiritual techniques. The battalion did not slow down at all. Instead, it only moved faster. In the dark room, where many figures were watching the battle play out, Rocketfellow was giving updates from time to time about many things that were happening off-screen. For example, although they had no way to record what happened in the Alliance headquarters, he did get an update on what happened there shortly after. "It seems the Midnight Inn has sent reinforcements, and they were not secretive about it," he said with a broad smile. "Moreover, the reinforcements only number 2, and are not so strong. They are most likely a diversion or a trap. It's also interesting to note that the reinforcements arrived from the headquarters, instead of teleporting from somewhere nearer to BGY 987. Would anyone care to venture what assumptions we can draw from this?" The devil was treating this completely like an exercise, and genuinely seemed to be analyzing things for future attempts. Most found such a mindset reassuring, as no one wanted to offend a powerful enemy for no reason, and that is exactly what the inn would become if their involvement was revealed. 2 of the participants, however, were extremely dissatisfied with this approach. One was the Gelati, who was desperate to get their hands on a hostage. They would not wait millions of years to force out Jill from the inn. The other was the believer of R.A. Although he no longer voiced his opinion, he was filled with indignation and an intense desire for revenge. But he had at least learned one thing from the devil, which was to follow a plan. Silently and secretly, the zealot had transmitted the information about this planet to the other surviving members of their religion. Soon, they would be relieved from the boredom of this tame play, and watch a real performance. Yet the zealot missed the hidden grin Rocketfellow wore whenever he looked at him. Just as he expected, the scapegoat was acting predictably. One of the things that he really wanted to study was how the inn would react upon the death of a few of its members. This information was crucial for future plans. Chapter 853 Apex Predator. During their march, whenever the battalion faced enemies, it cut through them swiftly using their thoroughly practiced and meticulously planned coordinated attacks. Even the arrangement of each soldier had been specifically assigned to improve their performance cohesively during their march. This allowed them to save time and, most importantly, energy during their march. While such an approach was extremely successful, this time, they opted to do things differently. Since they had arrived at the main battlefield, there was no need to save energy. Instead, they needed to be as destructive as possible. The battalion was charging at the void dwellers at full speed, yet just as they were on the verge of clashing, they transitioned into their mech formation. The execution was flawless, and extremely deadly. The mangled corpses of countless void dwellers were flung through the air as the mech used a simple backhand to break their defensive line. Crushing some of them by simply stepping on them, the mech plunged itself deep behind enemy lines. This time, Z was not using the mech's most powerful techniques. He instead opted to kill them using brute force and simple combat techniques. After all, this was just a warm-up for the real fight. Of course, to anyone else, even this warm-up would have been extremely deadly. As creatures that lived and thrived in the void, withheld from the safety and stability of living in proper space, the creatures had developed countless strange affinities and techniques. Moreover, unlike the previous, uncoordinated hordes they fought, these void dwellers were specifically being directed by a particularly strong void dweller that stood in the very back. Warmed up, the mech held out its hand as Z used one of techniques the battalion had acquired. From the spatial equipment of countless battalion members, seemingly random pieces of metal were released, but a moment later, a yellow beam covered them and brought them together into an arrangement that looked like a spear. A large spear made of metal and yellow energy was formed, taller than even the mech when rested on the ground. The body of the spear seemed to have many cracks, though those were only the places where the various metal pieces were joints. Yet instead of looking broken, the spear looked grand yet dangerous, as yellow light leaked through those cracks. The tip of the spear looked like an arrowhead, but was not actually sharp. In this instance, it was left dull on purpose, as the mech was meant to overcome its enemies with strength, not precision. Despite the large size of the spear, the mech only used its right hand to hold it, drawing emphasis instead to its empty left hand. But, for now, Z did not draw out any other weapon or tool. Enemies of this level were not worthy of it. Ending the brief interlude, the mech dove back into the whittled horde of void dwellers and resumed his massacre. Up on the cliff, the watching demons became extremely intimidated as they witnessed what seemed like an apex predator in action, yet their unwavering obedience kept them from escaping. It was fortunate, or else the mech would have had to spend more time hunting them down. Down below, the ferocious mech continued its slaughter, now much more deadly that it had revealed its weapon. It did not take long before 1,000 corpses laid at its feet, then 2,000 and then 3. At some point, the mech finally came face to face with the void dweller that was leading this pack. Their confrontation was to be an ultimate showdown of basic evolutionary excellence and a trained, honed warrior. But it was not. Z barely noticed the difference between it and every other creature he mercilessly slaughtered. One by one, the void tiers around the mech eventually closed, and the cannon fodder slowly died. Next, it would be the demon's turn to face them. Chapter 854 Dusk. In the extremely focused state that he was in, to Z it felt like mere minutes had passed since he began the battle. But the state of the horizon would beg to differ, for even the dusk was coming to a close, with the local star nearly out of sight. Hours had gone by. After all, even though the mech cut through the void dweller's swarm without suffering any harm, it was still a time-consuming endeavor, not to mention that more of them had been falling out of multiple tiers as well. Yet even so, what awaited them was only more grueling than what they had faced. Up on the cliff, more enemies awaited them, and they were better prepared as well. Anticipating such a situation was exactly why Z had refrained from using any energy-intensive techniques to speed up the process. Despite the extreme length of time, the battalion was not exhausted. In fact, they could go much longer given that they maintained the same rate of energy consumption. This particular feat had more to do with the replenishment feature of their suits than themselves. But, more than once, they had fought a battle where their reserves were nearing depletion, so they usually had an exit strategy in place. On this planet, in their given situation, however, that did not seem likely. Even if they wanted to retreat, they may not be able to. After all, the enemy had the ability to open spatial tiers where and when as they wished. The stake on the line was nothing more than their own demise. Confronted with such a reality, there was no hesitation in their hearts, only confidence. Had they faced such a situation on the very first battlefield they stepped on, they surely would have felt nervous, though they wouldn't have retreated even then. But after having been bathed in the anarchy of war, after having their wills tempered through fire and blood, after having their faith in the companions reaffirmed time and time again, there was no hesitation, nor was there doubt. The mech looked up and saw that a single demon stood at the precipice of the cliff, looking down at it. The rest were waiting a small distance from the edge. The weight of the lives of his companions did not weigh Z down. Instead, their trust and resolve only strengthened him, and lifted him to be better than his usual self. On this cursed planet, they had experienced naught but bad luck, and a cloudless thunder could only be a bad omen. Just as many of them were considering turning away, one of them, the only one with multicolored feathers, spoke. "I can detect massive amounts of spiritual energy being used that way. That is also the point where the new spatial ripples are coming from. Someone is fighting over there. Either the void dwellers are fighting each other, or there are more survivors that way." "Do you think we should help?" another asked, hesitantly. It was wounded. "They may have more information on the situation. We can't afford to let them die. Marzu, we march." Under the orders of their captain, they immediately began sprinting towards the noise. In the battle between a mech and countless demons, the TREXS were approaching. Sitting in the Silent Wanderer, Lex paced anxiously in the main hall. No matter how he urged Cirque to speed up, even if it meant taking risks, it was not possible to reach the planet quicker than 9 days. The problem was, Lex's evacuation plan relied on returning to the Midnight and using teleportation. For that, all he would need to do was stabilize space, and have them return using the keys. But, the Midnight Inn was sealing itself in just 5 days. Chapter 855, What Can We Do? As a general rule, most of the rooms in the Silent Wanderer had very few furnishings so as to use up as little space as possible. The main hall, where Lex was pacing, for example, only had a few sofas which were attached to the walls and a circular table that could retract into the floor. On the roof, there was a small module that could create projections anywhere in the room, and was hooked up to the main ship computers. This way, any information they wanted could be pulled up directly, anywhere in the room. The projections could even be interacted with. The walls had silverish-gray plates with lights in between the grooves, but they could undergo a change to display the space around the ship, turning the entire room into a massive display. These were nice features, but besides that the room was completely empty. It was not bad, since that would allow Lex to use the space however he wanted. Currently, that was as an empty room for him to roam mindlessly in. He was thinking of every possibility he could come up with on how he could speed up his commute, but nothing inside the inn was particularly helpful at the moment. As much as he didn't want to think about it, he may need to start planning for what he would do if they could not retreat to the inn. While that was less than ideal, since they would then be stuck outside the inn for nearly 1.5 years, he would have to deal with it if he could not come up with a solution. The greatest issue would be the possibility of the enemy pursuing them, since they could not retreat to the inn. They would be sitting ducks. As of right now, there was still one possible hope to still make it in time. That hope was to teleport back to the inn while Cirque traveled, go to the Emporium and see if they had anything that could help. The universe was a big place, so it was not too much to hope for an item that could speed up interstellar travel by a considerable margin, right? The Silent Wanderer is currently en route to a specific planet. At its current pace, if nothing unexpected happens on the way, it will reach its destination in 9 days. But I needed to reach there in less than 5 days. Preferably, even less than 4 days. What do you have that can help me? I can transfer whatever you give me directly to the ship, so that's not an issue. Powell was stumped. This was an issue he had never faced before. You have to understand that Silent Wanderer is a state-of-the-art ship, and its hyperdrives are the best in its size category. Speeding it up is just not possible. But that doesn't mean we can't help you get the ship to its destination faster. Let's see what we can do. He pulled out a tablet and started to input various search parameters as he was narrowing down the list of items that he could potentially use at the moment. Can you provide details of the destination, or the ship's path? For example, the size of the stars you will be crossing? If there are any gravity wells nearby, or if there are any asteroid belts in your path? Do you have the spatial coordinates of the planet? How stable is the space in your surroundings? All of these can be crucial information in helping us determine how to get you there as fast as possible. Lex slid the storage device to Powell and said, "This is all the information I have on the path. The space in the region is not stable, which is the greatest issue to begin with." One by one, Lex began to share relevant details while Powell kept narrowing his search parameters even more. Lex really did not want to get locked out of the inn again, so he had to make this work no matter what. Not to mention, the sooner he arrived, the quicker he could save the battalion. Chapter 856 Die. In the Emporium, Lex and Powell both stared in silence at the piece of paper in front of them. They had spent a few hours here already, discussing in detail what possible solutions they can pursue given the situation. Ultimately, they concluded that it was entirely possible. In fact, they even came up with multiple different solutions. Lex's willingness to pay obscene amounts of money for the best possible solution made life much easier. The reason they were currently stumped was that they could not conclude in finality which option was the best for Lex. After all, with multiple options available, they should opt for the best one. But that was too difficult to decide because the situation was too uncertain. The only thing they could say for certain was that the most powerful force at their disposal was not their cultivation, but their money. "I think I'll go with the addition of the blink module, and use that in conjunction with Calvaha Spectre Talisman," Lex finally said, not taking any risk. This was the best possible solution he could think of. If the situation were not so critical, Lex would definitely have felt the pinch since the Calvaha Spectre Talisman was a single-use item that cost him approximately 33 billion MP. But right now, the only reason Lex hesitated was not because it was expensive, but because it might not be the best solution. After all, MP could be earned again, but once his workers died, there was nothing more that could be done. "Very good, I'll go prepare everything. As I said beforehand, it will take a few hours to arrange everything. I'll wait here. You can go and prepare." In the dark room watching the projection, many of the observers were actually having a great time. It did not matter to them how many demons died, for the demons were not their subordinates. Nor had they contributed to this specific mission in any way, so they had no vested interest either. Instead, they were treating it like a grand show. Who could have believed that a measly 1,000 Foundation realm cultivators, who were human to boot, could provide this much entertainment? They were still fighting, and now even the Marzu were on their way. "If the humans destroy this monument, will it affect your plan?" someone asked the devil. "Not really. We're building more than one of these anyway. The point is not to teleport these 1,000 humans into the void, but the rescue party. I estimate that the rescue party will take at least a week to arrive. My monuments will be operable in just 4 more days. As soon as they land, I'll activate them. This way, the whole show will be teleported into the void. I'm very interested to see how the Midnight Inn will react then. I have a suspicion that if push comes to shove, they can teleport their workers out even from within the void. This is a good way of finding out. From within the void? Impossible." While the conversation was going on, the zealot looked at everyone with a mocking look. "A week? 4 days?" His companions were almost there. Once they reached, they would destroy the whole damn planet. He'd like to see how everyone would react then. Would the accursed devil still be so calm? Would the Midnight Inn suffer? Waves of excitement coursed through his mind as he imagined everyone's mournful faces. For desecrating the honor of RA, they should all die. Chapter 857 Small Deviation. Lex waited for 4 hours within the room, contemplating silently about how to proceed. He did not know how the battalion was faring, besides the fact that none of them had died yet. After all, if one of the inn workers died, he was bound to get a notification from the battalion panel even if not from the system itself. Where they had already survived for so long, they just needed to do so for a few more days. But it was the final stretch that always seemed the longest. Instead of dwelling on useless thoughts, Lex decided to spend the time thinking about his swordplay. Since he had already tried his hand at it, he had a sense for his natural preferences. He had immense strength, so theoretically one of the ways he could proceed was to keep his swordsmanship simple and direct, using brute strength and the inherent sharpness of his weapon as the foundation. Later on, once he spent more time practicing and got a better handle on more complex moves, could he start thinking about integrating them into his arsenal. In his mind, he replayed the single slash he had been practicing over and over. The problem he was having was that his mind and senses had become too astute, and so he could detect the tiny, imperceptible flaws everyone else looked over. This was just a single slash, and that too in practice. He had no idea how many flaws would reveal themselves when he actually fought or practiced with someone else properly. With nothing else to do, he began simulating a fight in his mind. It was easy, after all, he was controlling both the parties in his mind. Before the opponent even attacked him, he already knew what the attack was and how he should defend. It was not exactly ideal, but he just took it as practice for what kind of moves to practice later. Every maneuver he imagined himself doing to block or dodge an attack, he would practice later on. After another couple of hours, the module was connected. Suppressing his nervousness, Cirque returned to the cockpit and once again resumed the journey. He did not immediately use the module, for there were a lot of factors that determined its viability and functionality. Basically, once it was fully charged, the faster the ship was already going, the farther they would move once the module was activated. After 20 minutes, the ship once again activated its hyperdrive, allowing it to approach speeds that were required for interstellar travel. Then, after a moment, Crick activated the module. The process was far from smooth. Lex was much too spoiled by the amazing teleportation offered by the Inn, yet even when comparing to other, lower standards, using the Blink module provided an extremely uncomfortable and nauseating experience. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that the module worked. Or at least, it appeared to. "Where are we, Cirque? How far did we teleport?" Lex asked, and waited for Cirque to figure out exactly that. More important than teleporting, was ensuring that they were teleporting in the right direction. "I'm checking. We need to travel a bit so that the computer can cross-check significant landmarks and celestial bodies with those on the map. That's the only way to be sure." Lex did not say anything, and only waited for the silent wanderers' internal computers to determine their new location. Nearly 10 minutes later, the computer determined their location with 86% accuracy. "We deviated from the path by a bit, but the time lost from the deviation is insignificant when compared to the time gained. The module is working properly." Chapter 858, Magically Inclined. "Excellent. If we keep at it, how much time can we cut down?" Lex asked, his eyes gleaming with excitement. There were too many things that could have gone wrong, or else Powell would not have given them a manual. Fortunately, things worked out for now. "That depends on how long we can continue to teleport. Assuming that there is no issue, and we can go right up to the target planet like this, we'll be there in 20 hours. But realistically speaking, since we are anticipating issues with teleportation, it's tough to estimate how much time we've reduced. All I can say is that this is much faster than before." "I hope so," said Lex, almost as a whisper. The teleportation module was extremely expensive, and rare moreover. Lex had only been able to buy it due to his membership level at the Emporium. Or else, he would not have been able to get it even if he offered double the money. After all, some of the resources that went into making it were just too rare. There was a reason why only ultra-large empires and organizations could afford teleportation on an interstellar scale. Most other outfits just usually tolerated the long commute time in moving between the stars. Lex sat down in the co-pilot's seat and looked out into space. Ordinarily, he would have enjoyed the spectacular views a lot. But at this moment, he had subdued all his emotions and only waited silently until they faced their next hurdle. Right now, he had no time nor did he have the state of mind to get lost in his daydreams. Z grunted as the mech was blown into the air and fell hard on its back. It couldn't be helped. Ordinarily he would have perfectly dodged the incoming attack, but with space rippling all around him, it was difficult to anticipate how the altered space would affect each attack. Without wasting even a second, the mech rolled on the ground and quickly jumped up, avoiding a few more attacks. As soon as he delivered the attack, he moved away, dodging attacks on its back, and instead gaining an opportunity to attack a different demon altogether. The purple flames on the tip of his spear began to spread over its body, transforming the weapon into something even more deadly. Yet for all the advantages he had gained, he was unable to deliver a decisive blow. That was the problem with being outnumbered so heavily, and by opponents so strong. He had to continuously deliver small blows to numerous enemies until they accumulated into something that could have a significant impact. If he was allowed enough time to focus on one enemy at a time, they would have been defeated a long time ago, but such was not the case. Moreover, there was no use complaining either. Since even the flames, although extremely powerful, were not giving him a decisive edge, he decided to take an even bigger risk. This would surely shatter space as well, so he had to be ready for more void dwellers. Yet before he could make his move, lightning fell from the sky and struck the demon in front of him. Chains rose from the ground and tied up another. The temperature drastically dropped around, causing its body to freeze where it stood. The change was too sudden, the demons were not able to react in time. Although Z did not understand where the change came from, he did not hesitate to take advantage of it. Just as he slew the first massive demon, he finally saw the source of the sudden changes on the battlefield. In the distance, 23 massive figures could be seen approaching at incredible speeds. On their massive frames, Z could identify magicians' robes, and something in his mind clicked. Luther had already told him about them. One of the most magically inclined races in existence, the Marzu, had arrived. Chapter 859. All hope is lost, not. The mech took full advantage of the opening provided by the Marzu, and besides instantly slaying one of the massive demons, it dealt a serious blow to many others. At the same time, Z did not forget to observe the newcomers. Although supposedly they were on the same side, there was no guarantee that the Marzu would be interested in cooperating. After all, unlike humans, the Marzu were one of the most famous and renowned warrior races in the Origin realm, and perhaps even beyond. The group of Tyrannosaurus rexes, as they were called on Earth, towering and magnificent, had bodies adorned in sleek, shimmering silver feathers that could be seen through the many openings in their loose robes. These feathers, fluttering in the wind even as they carried a deadly sheen, cascaded down their massive forms, glistening under the starlight like a metallic cloak. Each of them had tall figures, their muscular frame enveloped in this resplendent plumage, resembling silver armor that ripples with every movement. In fact, Z almost felt like the reason their robes were loose to begin with was so that their formidable figures do not remain hidden. Despite their formidable appearance, the feathers lent an unexpected grace to these ancient predators. The feathers started from the base of their skulls and cascading down their necks, backs, and tails, creating a mesmerizing display of silvery hues in varying shades and lengths. Among this stunning group, the leader was easily distinguished by a striking array of multicolored feathers amidst the silver. The shades of iridescent blues, fiery reds, and vibrant greens interwoven among the silver, created a breathtaking spectacle that commanded attention. As these predators neared, Z recalled everything he knew about them. Looking upon their, suffice to say, abundant muscle and considerable size, it would be easy for one to assume that these creatures were designed for physical and close combat. Such an assumption would be incredibly incorrect. Any and all proper studies of the species had concluded the same thing. The only reason they had such strong bodies was so that their bodies could tolerate the copious amounts of magical energy coursing through them. They hardly ever relied on actual physical combat. In fact, the reason such a formidable race went extinct on Earth, most likely, was solely due to the severe lack of spiritual energy, from which they extracted magical energy. As they neared, Z could finally see that each one of them also wielded a staff or wand in their short arms. Each time they cast one of their spells, the wand or staff would glow before a devastatingly powerful attack rocked the demon army. Surprisingly, regardless of how powerful their attacks were, the space did not seem to destabilize because of it. Truly, compared to the path of cultivators, magicians were mysterious and knowledgeable in many things. Carefully, without breaking the flow of combat, Z positioned himself away from the approaching Marzu, putting a number of massive demons between himself and them. Until he knew for certain what their stance was, it would be best not to get too close. But while Z prepared the mech for a tough fight, possibly even resulting in massive spatial tears, the Marzu couldn't care less. Their leader, her feathers adorning her like war paint, seemed to fix her gaze on the newcomers, and attacked, without hesitation. Although their purpose in coming was to look for survivors and discover what the situation was, a glance at the half-built monument was all it took for them to understand that the demons and devils played a massive role in their current predicament. Dark purple clouds formed in the air above the devils, blotting out the sky. This was not a technique by the devils, but a spell of the Marzu. A grotesque hand, radiating an aura of severe repulsion, emerged from the clouds and slammed down on the devils, taking them by surprise. Yet a moment later the hand was destroyed, and the previous two dashing-looking devils revealed their true bodies. Both were tall, although one had completely red skin, 3 horns protruding from its head and a pair of thin, leathery wings, while the other was covered in gray scales. It had no wings or tail, but its horns looked more like a tainted crown than anything else. Their power skyrocketed, and space seemed to bend around them, as if the weight of their existence itself surpassed what this place could tolerate. Their previous grins returned, and one of them was about to speak, when a devastating beam of purple fire streaked through the air, tearing space as it did, and struck them faster than they could react. The devils were pushed into the tear by the momentum of the blast. Their arrival, marked by an aura of impending danger and devastation, almost seemed comical in front of the abrupt nature of their departure. The Marzu, who had specifically been trying to avoid causing space tears, were stunned. You could do this too? Even Z was somewhat surprised by how easy that was. He did not think his plan would work, and so easily at that. The only ones who weren't stunned were the demons. Finally free of the restrictions of their devil overlords, the army scattered like fleeing ants, unwilling to face these monsters any longer. The Marzu quickly sprung into action, dissatisfied to allow any of the demons to escape. Z, on the other hand, was still hesitating. Was that it? Shouldn't there be more? What about the bad guy's final form? Were there secret backup plans? He hadn't even had a chance to use technique, big ball of ultimate destruction. He was waiting for the critical moment when all hope seemed lost. But now there was an abundance of hope, and the enemy was escaping. Should he still use it? Genuinely unsure of what to do, Z actually consulted Luther. First, thoroughly destroy the monument. Make sure it's completely unsalvageable. Then approach the Marzu leader for negotiations. If we join forces, we'll be a much more formidable fighting force. The chances of surviving until reinforcements arrive will be much greater. Chapter 860. No point in discriminating. With new directions, Z got over the sense of loss he felt at being unable to use his new technique. Logically speaking, it was a good thing that they hadn't been pushed to the point of hopelessness. Not to mention, they were hardly safe yet. Who knew, maybe the devils would return from the void, having gained immense power, seeking vengeance. Isn't that how background characters later became named characters later on in some of the comics he read? With renewed motivation, the mech launched itself into the escaping demons, and cut its way to the already damaged monument. To be specific, it had been split into two as the ground beneath it split open, but the structure on both sides was, more or less, still standing. Unfamiliar with how this monument was supposed to work, he decided to take no risks and destroyed it by smashing it repeatedly with his spear. He was not concerned about the spear getting damaged in the process, for the pieces of metal it was made of were actually extremely well refined, very specific parts used to make the spear. The yellow light that held the pieces together also strengthened them, and allowed them to display greater strength. Once that was done, the mech turned towards the escaping demons. Truth be told, ordinarily, Z would never attack escaping enemies. After all, they had lost their will to fight, and were no longer a threat. Unfortunately, these demons were not here to fight in a war, but to specifically target them. Moreover, all it would take was a single devil for them to once again take up arms against the battalion. As such, he could not give up such an opportunity to reduce the number of his future enemies. It was clear, though, that his actions lacked the same level of motivation he displayed earlier. An hour later, the battle was more or less over, and the mech returned to the site of the monument, waiting for the Marzu to finish their hunt. Unlike him, they seemed particularly vindictive in hunting down the demons, and did not want to spare even a single one. But that gave him a good opportunity to rest and recover. Although he did not disable the mech form, in case negotiations with the Marzu did not go well, or in case they were not even there to negotiate in the first place, the battalion was now nearing exhaustion. They were not at their limit yet, especially since they were taking this opportunity to replenish their spiritual energy. Their physical exertion was now getting to them. They had not slept or eaten anything in a while, and had been fighting non-stop. No matter how much discipline and determination they displayed, it would not fill their stomachs. But, for now, all they could do was endure. Fortunately, due to their battle lust, the Marzu took their time in pursuing as many demons as they could, giving the battalion enough time to recover somewhat. When the massive feathery magicians returned, their formidable figures painting an impressive sight, they surrounded the mech, their eyes filled with a menacing glow. Their leader was one step ahead, and stood directly opposite to the mech, staring it down. Z hesitated, and asked Luther the specific terms he wanted. It was always good to make sure. He was glad he did, for Luther had a very firm stance on the matter, although Z could not decide if he was not surprised at all, or extremely surprised to hear it. Whether you pledge to fight or not, we would help you leave regardless. That is the way of the Midnight Inn. Whenever anyone in the universe seeks refuge and rest, they are welcome to the Midnight Inn for as long as they wish. But, if you wish to fight, then instead of protection, we ask that you find and destroy other monuments such as the one that was here. You mean there are more of these? Feyor asked, her eyes narrowing. Although she had not mentioned it, she and her kind knew more about the monument than the battalion. That was because they could detect the magical signatures it gave off. Reading the residual energy, they could detect its purpose. Simply pulling the planet into the void did not seem like it encompassed all that the monument was being designed to do, it was merely one of its many aspects. I cannot say for certain, but I suspect as much. After all, since the enemy has access to the entire planet, why build a monument so close to two parties of survivors? Feyor turned to look at her subordinates, and seemed to communicate with them telepathically. It was difficult to discern what they were saying, but all of them looked incensed. We will join you in your hunt for the monuments, Feyor finally answered, after she finished communing with her own group. She was agreeing to hunt down the monuments, but at the same time, she did not want to separate from the battalion. After all, although they claimed that they would help, there was no guarantee. It was best to remain close together in such circumstances. In that case, we will move out after a short rest. If you can search the other monuments somehow in the meantime, that would be very useful. If not, we'll figure something out. With the agreement made, the mech dissolved to once again form 1,000 different soldiers. They stood, side by side, and in battle formation, though fatigue was apparent in their eyes. They waited to see if the Marzu had any reaction to seeing them like this, but they had already seen through the mech. Although they were not familiar with humans, they did not discriminate against them. After all, when compared to the Marzu, all other races were equally inferior. There was no point in discrimination between them.